The spring of 1943 presented an unyielding barrage of challenges for the commanding officers of the 8th Air Force, who found themselves poring over disheartening loss reports within their English operational centers. The much-anticipated P-47 Thunderbolt had arrived on the European theater of operations, heralded by bold proclamations of invincibility. This formidable machine represented 7 tons of meticulous American engineering, meticulously crafted around the most potent radial engine ever integrated into a single-seat fighter aircraft. However, the stark realities unfolding in the skies above occupied Europe painted a dramatically different picture, a narrative etched in the somber contrails of downed aircraft and the distressing void of empty seats at post-mission debriefing sessions. The 56th Fighter Group initiated their combat engagements with the Thunderbolts on April 8, 1943, undertaking critical escort duties for B-17 bombers tasked with striking German industrial infrastructure. Within a mere fortnight, the pilots' first-hand accounts began to cascade into reports that instilled a palpable sense of unease among procurement officials stationed in Washington. The P-47 was consistently described as exhibiting a pronounced sluggishness when operating below 15,000 feet, an altitude where the nimble Focke-Wulf 190s effortlessly outmaneuvered the American heavyweights. Its rate of climb proved disappointingly slow, and its turning radius was a source of considerable embarrassment. Furthermore, the Luftwaffe had already astutely discerned a tactical weakness. A direct head-on pass, immediately followed by a swift split-S maneuver, could effectively enable German pilots to vanish from sight before the Thunderbolt pilots could even bring their armaments to bear. Colonel Hubert Zemke, the commanding officer of the 56th, dedicated those initial weeks to attentively listening to his pilots' grievances regarding their experiences fighting in what they derisively termed the 7-ton milk jug. The aircraft's voracious fuel consumption rendered any meaningful escort duration over Germany an unattainable fantasy. Pilots would traverse the English Channel, provide protective cover for the bombers for a meager 30 minutes, and then be compelled to return to base before their fuel reserves were completely depleted. Concurrently, Messerschmitt 109s and FW-190s would patiently await the departure of the Thunderbolts, subsequently launching devastating assaults on the bomber formations with unbridled impunity. We kindly request your continued attention to the remainder of this video. Your support, expressed through a like and subscription, would be deeply appreciated. Please also consider leaving a comment below, sharing your geographic location and your thoughts on the topic discussed in this video. The tactical situation deteriorated even further when considering the critical observations pilots were making, or more accurately, the significant visual deficiencies they were encountering. The P-47's distinctive razorback canopy design inadvertently created substantial blind spots, transforming the crucial act of checking one's 6 o'clock position into a physically strenuous and ultimately inadequate exercise. Luftwaffe pilots, with their keen tactical insight, exploited these dead zones with ruthless efficiency, precisely positioning themselves within these areas before initiating their attacks. After-action reports compiled throughout April and early May meticulously documented numerous instances of P-47s being ambushed from above and behind, with the initial indication of an assault often being the jarring impact of 20 mm cannon shells tearing through the fuselage. By the middle of May 1943, a subtle undercurrent of apprehension permeated some staff officers, leading to quiet conjectures that the P-47 program might regrettably represent a billion-dollar miscalculation. The aircraft demonstrably excelled at altitudes of 25,000 feet and above, where its sophisticated turbocharged engine delivered a performance capability that could either match or even surpass any contemporary Luftwaffe aircraft. However, aerial combat rarely remained confined to such lofty heights. Dogfights invariably spiraled downwards, and at lower altitudes, the Thunderbolt frequently transitioned from being a formidable predator to a vulnerable prey. Compounding these issues, early combat losses suggested that the aircraft was unable to withstand battle damage to the extent promised by its engineers. 3 P-47s had been lost within the inaugural month, due to what appeared to be comparatively minor damage, including engine fires, structural failures, and control system malfunctions, that ultimately proved fatal. The 78th Fighter Group commenced operational duties alongside the 56th during April, and their experiences unequivocally mirrored the pervasive problems. Pilots consistently reported that German fighter pilots appeared to be emboldened, pressing their attacks with greater proximity and for extended durations than they had against other American aircraft types. Intelligence officers posited the theory that the Luftwaffe had meticulously conducted its research, thoroughly analyzing the P-47's performance envelope and systematically identifying its exploitable weaknesses. Their evolving doctrine seemed to focus on specific tactics, attacking from below and behind, forcing the Thunderbolt into disadvantageous turning engagements, and specifically targeting its large radial engine with incendiary rounds. Standard Luftwaffe combat doctrine, it seemed, was undergoing a specific evolution designed to directly counter American aerial tactics. Robert S. Johnson had been actively flying P-47s with the 61st Fighter Squadron, a component of the 56th Fighter Group, since March 1943. By late May, he had accumulated sufficient combat hours to thoroughly comprehend the Thunderbolt's inherent strengths, while simultaneously cursing its pronounced weaknesses. The aircraft conveyed a reassuring sense of solidity, almost comfortingly massive, yet that very bulk rendered it ponderous and unwieldy in the intense, close-quarters maneuverings of a dogfight. Johnson had personally witnessed squadron mates making critical errors, attempting to engage in turning fights with the agile FW-190s, or endeavoring to climb away from diving Me-109s. And he had subsequently attended the somber gatherings held in the aftermath, when those pilots tragically failed to return. The paramount question, the one that transcended considerations of speed, climb rate, or turn radius, remained untested. When a P-47 sustained severe damage, when the precise aim of German guns found their mark and tore into that massive airframe, what would be the subsequent outcome? Could the Thunderbolt genuinely absorb significant punishment and continue its flight, or would it simply disintegrate like any other fighter once battle damage surpassed its structural limits? The engineering reports provided one set of answers. Actual combat, however, was poised to deliver another. And on May 26, 1943, Johnson was about to provide the definitive answer that everyone had been anxiously awaiting, even if he harbored no desire for the task. May 26, 1943, unfolded like countless other mission mornings at Horsham St. Faith Airfield, characterized by the biting English drizzle, the nervous, ritualistic pre-flight preparations, and the incessant activity of ground crews swarming over P-47s that perpetually seemed to require attention and repairs. Johnson's assigned aircraft for that day bore the standard Republic Aviation serial number 428487, a Thunderbolt that had accrued approximately 40 combat hours without encountering anything more dramatic than a few minor flak dings. The mission briefing outlined a seemingly straightforward bomber escort assignment to Santo in northern France, involving the protection of B-17s as they targeted German airfields and vital rail yards. The 56th Fighter Group launched 58 P-47s that morning, meticulously forming up over the English coastline before charting a course southeastward across the Channel. Johnson occupied a position within the 61st Fighter Squadron's second element, snugly tucked into the formation, enabling him to maintain continuous visual contact with his flight leader, while simultaneously scanning the expansive sky for those telltale dark specks that invariably signaled impending danger. For once, the weather proved cooperative. Scattered clouds lingered at 8,000 feet, with clear skies above, offering visibility that stretched for miles. Ideal conditions for discerning both the bomber formations below and potential enemy fighters above. They penetrated French airspace at an altitude of 26,000 feet, with throttles precisely calibrated for maximum endurance. 17 distinct groups of B-17s proceeded towards their designated targets in a methodical procession that, from high altitude, appeared orderly, but, upon closer inspection, represented a meticulously controlled chaos. Johnson's assignment was, in theory, uncomplicated, to effectively deter German fighters from reaching the bomber formations until dwindling fuel levels necessitated the P-47's return journey home. In practical terms, this translated into an unwavering state of vigilance, a constant swiveling of the neck, and eyes burning from the relentless strain of scrutinizing the bright sky, ceaselessly searching for enemy aircraft that could materialize from any direction. The initial indication that something had gone awry occurred at 13 to 15 hours when Johnson's wingman urgently broadcasted "bandits at 4 o'clock high." Johnson forcefully craned his head around, squinting intensely through the P-47's canopy framework, and immediately caught the distinct glint of sunlight reflecting off enemy canopies. Focke-Wulf 190s, an estimated 8 to 10 of them, were diving precipitously from 28,000 feet, leveraging both the altitude advantage and the formidable speed derived from a perfectly executed bounce. The German formation fragmented as it descended, with some fighters converging on the bombers, while others specifically targeted the P-47 escorts. Johnson's flight leader promptly commanded a sharp right turn to confront the imminent threat, and the Thunderbolts responded with the characteristic sluggishness that frequently caused P-47 pilots to curse their aircraft's substantial weight. The FW-190s relentlessly pressed their attack, and Johnson, with the piercing clarity that only crystallizes in the crucible of combat, recognized that the geometrical dynamics were decidedly unfavorable to the American forces. The Germans had flawlessly timed their bounce, catching the P-47's mid-formation turn, a moment when individual aircraft were at their most vulnerable. What transpired next unfolded within the compressed, distorted temporal perception that combat pilots frequently describe, an amalgamation of simultaneous events that paradoxically felt like agonizing slow motion. Johnson observed tracers arcing perilously past his canopy, heard the jarring metallic hammering of rounds impacting his aircraft, and felt the P-47 shudder violently under the force of the impacts. His initial instinctive reaction proved correct, a hard break to the left, designed to disrupt the attacker's firing solution and extricate himself from the line of fire. He hauled the control stick sharply to the side, and the Thunderbolt responded, albeit not with sufficient alacrity. The FW-190 that had singled out Johnson belonged to a Luftwaffe pilot who possessed an intimate understanding of how to destroy P-47s, or at least believed he did. The German fighter rapidly closed the distance to less than 200 yards, point-blank range where even mediocre gunnery could yield devastating results, and unleashed the full fury of every weapon mounted in its wings. 420mm MG 151 cannons and two 7.92mm machine guns, collectively delivering an approximate rate of 1,600 rounds per minute of concentrated fire, were all directed at Johnson's Thunderbolt as the two aircraft merged in a crossing shot that, by all accounts, should have been fatal. Johnson felt his P-47 reel as cannon shells ripped into the engine cowling, penetrated the fuselage directly behind the cockpit, and tore into the right wing. The canopy panel immediately adjacent to his head developed a star-shaped fracture from a bullet impact that inexplicably failed to fully penetrate. A cascade of warning lights illuminated his instrument panel, oil pressure plummeted, hydraulic pressure vanished, and engine temperature surged dangerously into the red zone. The control stick felt alarmingly wrong in his hand, mushy and unresponsive, as if the control cables had been partially severed. The FW-190 flashed past, and Johnson instinctively sought its position, fully anticipating that the German pilot would either disengage or execute a turn for a decisive finishing pass. What he witnessed instead, however, caused his blood temperature to plummet. His internal temperature began to plummet. The formidable Focke-Wulf fighter was executing a precise turn, preparing for another devastating assault, while Johnson, a severely crippled Thunderbolt, remained incapable of any evasive maneuvers. The rest of his squadron had dispersed during the initial surprise attack, either engaging other enemy aircraft or diving away from the sudden ambush. Johnson found himself isolated, injured, and on the precipice of receiving a second barrage from an adversary intent on confirming his kill. The subsequent attack originated from Johnson's 7 o'clock position, with the FW-190 smoothly gliding into a textbook attack formation. Meanwhile, Johnson desperately wrestled with the controls, attempting to coax even the slightest evasive movement from his badly damaged Thunderbolt. He managed a meager 15 degrees of bank before the controls completely seized. It appeared that vital cables had either been severed by gunfire or became hopelessly jammed by twisted metal. The German pilot, recognizing a defenseless target, proceeded with deliberate patience, closing the distance to what Johnson later estimated was a mere 150 yards. This proximity allowed Johnson to discern intricate details of the enemy aircraft, the distinct cowling, the spinning propeller, and even what seemed to be victory markings emblazoned on the fuselage. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please leave a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The second volley of fire, lasting perhaps 3 agonizing seconds, inflicted catastrophic damage. Cannon shells mercilessly ripped through the Thunderbolt's tail section, obliterating substantial portions of both the rudder and elevator. Additional rounds tracked relentlessly up the fuselage spine. Each impact resonated through the airframe as a distinct, jarring metallic clang, which Johnson experienced as much through physical sensation as through sound. His right wing sustained multiple direct hits, with one shell detonating internally within the main spar, causing the entire wing structure to flex in a manner utterly contrary to its design specifications. The instrument panel directly in front of him utterly disintegrated. Glass shards exploded outwards, gauges spun wildly out of control, and electrical systems shorted out in dramatic cascades of sparks. Then, a 20mm shell struck the canopy rail, a mere 18 inches from Johnson's head. Although the round did not penetrate the plexiglass, the impact caused the material to crack in a dense, spider-web-like pattern, transforming his forward visibility into an opaque, distorted blur. Fragments of shrapnel peppered the right side of his flight suit, and he felt a disconcerting warmth of blood trickling down his neck, though he would only later discover he had sustained shrapnel wounds to his shoulder and ear. The cockpit rapidly filled with a choking pall of smoke, whether originating from electrical fires or battle damage remained unclear, and the acrid ammonia odor of hydraulic fluid mingled sickeningly with the pungent cordite smell of expended ammunition. Johnson's instinctive response should have been to abandon the stricken aircraft. The P-47 was unequivocally doomed, critical systems were failing across the board, and its structural integrity was, at best, highly questionable. Yet something compelled him to refrain from reaching for the canopy jettison handle. Perhaps it was the considerable altitude, still around 24,000 feet, a height that would entail a prolonged parachute descent under the watchful eyes of German ground forces. Perhaps it was the vast distance. He was somewhere over northern France, with 50 miles of hostile territory, separating him from the relative safety of the English Channel. Or perhaps it was simply the ingrained stubbornness characteristic of a fighter pilot, an unyielding refusal to relinquish an aircraft that, despite its dire condition, was still technically airborne, even if flying had become a remarkably generous descriptor. The FW-190 disengaged after that second devastating pass, and Johnson braced himself for the inevitable third attack that would surely seal his fate. He waited 5 seconds, then 10, then 15. Nothing materialized. He cautiously risked a glance over his shoulder through the crazed and distorted canopy and observed the German fighter orbiting approximately 500 yards behind him, neither initiating another attack nor departing, simply observing. Later, Johnson would comprehend the rationale behind that Luftwaffe pilot's actions. The P-47 appeared utterly finished, clearly doomed, already trailing smoke and shedding debris. Why expend precious ammunition on an aircraft that was destined to crash on its own within the next few minutes? However, the Thunderbolt defied expectations and did not succumb. The massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, an engineering marvel, continued its operation despite absorbing multiple direct cannon hits in its accessory section. Oil pressure had plummeted to an almost negligible level, and coolant temperature was rapidly ascending past limits that should have caused the engine to seize irrevocably. Yet those 18 robust cylinders persevered, continuing to fire, turning the propeller, and generating just enough thrust to maintain something approximating controlled flight. Johnson cautiously eased the throttle back, attempting to alleviate the immense thermal load, and the engine responded with a distinct cough and a shudder, but steadfastly refused to quit. His immediate and pressing concern was not the engine's precarious state, rather it was the profound loss of control. The elevator cables had either been completely severed or irrevocably jammed, leaving him with virtually no pitch authority. The rudder was partially destroyed, providing perhaps a mere 20% of its normal yaw control. The aileron still functioned, albeit marginally, though the compromised right wing transformed any banking motion into a perilous gamble. Through careful experimentation, Johnson discovered he could maintain a semblance of level flight by constantly modulating engine power and meticulously adjusting the trim tabs. But anything more aggressive than the gentlest turn threatened to send the aircraft into an uncontrollable spin or precipitate catastrophic structural failure. The second critical challenge was navigation. His compass had been obliterated during the instrument panel's destruction. His radio was completely inoperable, and the severely cracked canopy distorted familiar landmarks beyond any recognizable form. Johnson possessed a general sense of England's direction, west and slightly north, but precise navigation was an absolute impossibility. He selected a heading based on the sun's angle and his mental visualization of the French coastline, then focused his entire being on keeping the wounded Thunderbolt airborne long enough to reach friendly territory. It was at this critical juncture that the oil smoke intensified dramatically. The engine was quite literally consuming itself. Metal components were expanding far beyond their design tolerances. Bearings were running dangerously dry, and cylinder heads were glowing a menacing cherry red behind the cowling. Johnson could now distinctly smell it, the unmistakable odor of burning. Oil mingled with superheated metal and an unidentifiable, yet instinctively recognized, ominous scent. Each cylinder's firing was a testament to extraordinary resilience, a minor miracle in itself. Every revolution of that propeller represented borrowed time. The few remaining functional gauges displayed conditions that Republic's engineers would have unequivocally declared impossible. An engine should not, by any engineering principle, continue to operate under such extreme parameters. Yet it stubbornly did. The P-47's remarkable survival in such dire circumstances ultimately stemmed from fundamental engineering decisions made 2 years prior in a Republic aviation design room situated on Long Island. These choices, which might have appeared overly cautious or even extravagant at the time, proved to be nothing short of providential over the battlefields of France. Alexander Cardvelli, Republic's visionary chief designer, had conceived and built the Thunderbolt around a design philosophy that other aircraft manufacturers often deemed wasteful: to construct every component with strength far exceeding its theoretical requirements, to incorporate redundancy wherever feasible, and to never, under any circumstances, compromise structural integrity for marginal weight savings. The culmination of this philosophy was an aircraft that, despite weighing 3,000 pounds more than a Messerschmitt 109, possessed an unparalleled ability to absorb battle damage that would invariably reduce German fighters to scattered falling debris. The very core of this extraordinary survivability was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, an 18-cylinder radial power plant, displacing a massive 2,800 cubic inches and capable of generating an astonishing 2,000 horsepower at war emergency power. Radial engines inherently possessed significant advantages in combat damage tolerance that their inline counterparts simply could not match. The circular arrangement of the cylinders meant that the loss of 1 or even 3 cylinders to enemy fire still left 15 functional combustion chambers capable of propelling the aircraft. In contrast, an inline engine, such as the Allison V1710 found in the P-40 or the Merlin in the Spitfire, concentrated all 12 cylinders within a narrow linear block. A single, accurately placed cannon shell could easily crack the engine block or sever the crankshaft, instantly rendering the entire power plant inoperable. Johnson's engine had sustained at least 6 direct hits, 3 of which were 20mm cannon shells that had penetrated the accessory case and destroyed the oil pump housing. Under normal operating conditions, the complete loss of oil pressure would inevitably lead to engine failure within a mere 90 seconds, as bearings seized and pistons irrevocably welded themselves to cylinder walls. However, the R-2800's immense thermal mass and exceptionally robust construction bought crucial time. The engine was indeed in the process of self-destruction, but it was doing so slowly. Each revolution relentlessly ground away metal and generated heat that could no longer be effectively dissipated. It was dying, but at a rate measured in minutes rather than mere seconds. The airframe itself incorporated structural redundancies that were conspicuously absent in other contemporary fighters. Republic had engineered the P-47 around a formidable internal structure: heavy-gauge longerons, extensively reinforced bulkheads, and a wing spar designed to withstand loads far exceeding normal flight stresses. This overkill construction undoubtedly added weight, but it simultaneously created a damage-tolerant structure, where the severing of one load path did not immediately precipitate catastrophic failure. Johnson's right wing, for instance, had taken a 20mm shell that annihilated 6 feet of its rear spar. Yet the remaining front spar and the robust skin plating were capable of carrying sufficient load to keep the wing securely attached to the fuselage. The control system exhibited a similar degree of redundancy. P-47 control cables were routed through armored channels and utilized a dual-cable arrangement for all critical control surfaces. When cannon fire severed Johnson's primary elevator cables, the backup cables, though degraded, maintained partial control authority. The system was undeniably compromised, barely functional, but it remained functional enough to keep the aircraft pointed in something resembling the correct direction. This contrasted sharply with the Focke-Wulf 190, which employed a sophisticated but inherently vulnerable hydraulic control system. A single hit to a hydraulic line in the FW-190 would result in the complete and immediate loss of control for that specific surface. Even the fuel system reflected Kartveli's meticulously thorough, almost paranoid, design philosophy. The P-47 carried its fuel in self-sealing tanks, which were further protected by armor plating and strategically positioned to minimize the risk of fire. These tanks incorporated a specialized rubber compound ingeniously developed by the U.S. Rubber Company, which would swell and effectively seal itself when exposed to fuel, thereby closing bullet holes before any significant fuel loss could occur. Johnson's aircraft had sustained multiple machine gun rounds through its left main tank, but the sophisticated self-sealing mechanism performed precisely as designed. The holes closed, fuel loss ceased, and the critical fire risk remained remarkably manageable. The peril of fire, surprisingly, continued to be manageable, a testament to the robust engineering of the aircraft. The transparent dome, which had merely starred with radiating cracks rather than shattering into deadly fragments under the intense barrage of cannon fire, was constructed from laminated bulletproof glass. This formidable material, 3/4 of an inch thick, possessed the remarkable capability of withstanding armor-piercing rounds up to a formidable .50 caliber. The 20mm shell, which had struck the canopy, fortunately impacted at an oblique angle, thus expertly distributing the immense kinetic energy across a significantly larger surface area. This crucial factor meant that while the glass did crack, it commendably held its structural integrity, its multiple laminate layers diligently preventing the catastrophic fragmentation that would have otherwise unleashed razor-sharp plexiglass shrapnel directly into Johnson's face and eyes. In stark contrast, typical German fighter aircraft were equipped with standard plexiglass canopies, which, though lighter and more economical to produce, offered absolutely no ballistic protection whatsoever. Republic Aviation had also meticulously engineered the placement of critical operational systems with potential combat damage as a primary consideration. The radio apparatus, the intricate electrical systems, and the vital hydraulic reservoirs were strategically dispersed throughout the fuselage, deliberately avoiding their concentration in any single highly vulnerable location. Consequently, Johnson's hydraulics were completely inoperable, his radio communications thoroughly destroyed, and a full half of his electrical system rendered entirely offline. However, the engine's crucial ignition system operated on a distinct, separate electrical bus that had miraculously endured the onslaught. Furthermore, the magnetos, which were responsible for firing the spark plugs, were engine-driven and functioned independently of the main electrical system. An additional layer of redundancy that proved instrumental in keeping the powerful engine running even as numerous other essential systems failed around it. This particular design philosophy, prioritizing survivability above all else, inevitably incurred significant financial outlays that peacetime accountants would undoubtedly have found utterly abhorrent. The P-47 Thunderbolt, for instance, demanded an astonishing 5,500 man-hours for its construction, a substantial increase compared to the 4,000 man-hours required for a P-51 Mustang. It also consumed considerably more aluminum, a greater quantity of steel, and a broader array of exotic materials. The unit cost soared to $85,000, dwarfing the $51,000 price tag of a Mustang. Yet, high above the embattled skies of France, with his aircraft riddled by an estimated 200 bullet holes and his very existence hanging precariously on the structural margins and redundant systems, Johnson was unequivocally realizing the full, invaluable return on those additional 1,500 man-hours of labor and the extra $34,000 investment. The Thunderbolt, though neither aesthetically pleasing nor particularly efficient in its design, continued its defiant flight, defying all rational analyses that dictated it, should by all accounts be scattered in fragments across the verdant French farmland. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. The Luftwaffe's unwavering confidence in their ability to decisively dispatch P-47s was deeply rooted in 18 months of brutally successful campaigns against earlier generations of American fighters. When the sleek P-38 Lightnings initially made their appearance over the European theater in late 1942, German pilots swiftly and accurately identified their inherent, fatal weaknesses. The distinctive twin-engine configuration meant that a strike to a single engine frequently resulted in an uncontrollable yaw, and the Allison engines themselves were notoriously susceptible to overheating and subsequent failure at higher altitudes. Consequently, FW-190 pilots rapidly devised and perfected a standard tactical approach. They would target one engine, observe the P-38 torque into an unrecoverable spin, and then proceed with chilling efficiency to their next unfortunate victim. By the spring of 1943, Luftwaffe squadron intelligence reports had unequivocally categorized the P-38 as a high-priority target, with an exceptionally high kill probability. The P-40 Warhawk regrettably fared even worse in the demanding European skies. Originally conceived and designed for low-altitude combat scenarios in the North African and Pacific theaters, the P-40 was thoroughly outclassed in virtually every performance category by the advanced 1943 model German fighters. Luftwaffe pilots, in fact, barely even considered them a credible threat. Its Allison engine simply lacked the capacity to generate sufficient power above 15,000 feet. The airframe itself proved to be remarkably fragile under the sustained stresses of combat, and battle damage that a P-47 would nonchalantly shrug off would invariably send a P-40 spiraling downwards, trailing ominous plumes of smoke and flames. German after-action reports meticulously compiled from operations in Tunisia and Sicily during early 1943 extensively documented P-40 kill ratios that exceeded a staggering 3.1 in Germany's favor. When the P-47s began to appear in significant numbers during April 1943, Luftwaffe tactical analysis officers made what, at the time, seemed like entirely reasonable assumptions based on the limited intelligence available to them. The Americans, they deduced, had introduced yet another heavyweight fighter, one that was conspicuously larger and heavier than any other aircraft currently flying, powered by a colossal radial engine. German intelligence accurately identified the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 and proceeded to calculate power-to-weight ratios that strongly suggested inherently poor maneuverability. Early combat engagements appeared to confirm these initial predictions. P-47s consistently proved unable to outturn the agile FW-190s, could not match the climbing performance of the Bf-109Gs, and seemed to actively avoid low-altitude combat altogether. Jagdgeschwader 2, JG-2, and JG-26, the elite Luftwaffe units tasked with the defense of occupied France and the Low Countries, consequently updated their tactical doctrines to reflect these observations. Attack briefs specifically emphasized exploiting the P-47's poor low-speed handling characteristics and the expansive blind spots created by its distinctive razorback canopy. The recommended engagement geometry called for aggressive diving attacks from positions of altitude and advantage, typically from above and behind. This approach allowed German pilots to utilize their altitude superiority to build considerable speed, then break away decisively before the Thunderbolt could bring its formidable heavy firepower to bear effectively. This tactic proved highly successful. April and early May 1943 witnessed a consistent stream of P-47 losses attributed directly to these well-coordinated bounce attacks. German pilots also noted with keen interest that P-47s appeared particularly susceptible to engine damage. The large radial engine presented a massive target area, and unlike inline engines, which were often tucked neatly behind streamlined cowlings, the R-2800 cylinders were directly exposed to enemy fire. Luftwaffe armament officers therefore recommended focusing fire specifically on the engine during head-on passes, utilizing the MG 151 20mm cannon, loaded with a potent mix of armor-piercing and high-explosive incendiary rounds. The prevailing theory was that even if an immediate kill was not achieved, significant engine damage would compel the P-47 to disengage from the battle and head back towards home base, thereby effectively removing it from the immediate combat zone. What German intelligence critically failed to comprehend was the profound, fundamental difference between the P-47's construction and that of every other Allied fighter aircraft they had encountered thus far. The Luftwaffe possessed extensive operational experience in destroying aircraft that had been built under the stringent constraints of peacetime weight restrictions and material limitations. British Spitfires and Hurricanes, for instance, utilized highly efficient but inherently lightweight structural designs. Soviet fighters were famously fragile, sometimes incorporating plywood components to conserve strategic metals. Even the P-38, despite its twin engines, was designed with a meticulous focus on minimizing weight for optimal performance. The P-47, however, emerged from an entirely distinct design philosophy, one that was made possible by the immense industrial capacity of America and a deliberate willingness to accept significant weight penalties in exchange for vastly superior survivability. Luftwaffe pilots simply had no prior frame of reference for an aircraft that could absorb an astonishing 50 or even 60 direct hits and yet continue its determined flight. Their accumulated experience dictated that such a level of damage unequivocally meant structural failure, an inevitable fire, or an immediate forced landing. The very concept of an aircraft deliberately overbuilt to withstand and survive extensive battle damage simply did not exist within their tactical calculations or their understanding of aerial combat. This critical blind spot extended all the way up to the highest echelons of Luftwaffe leadership. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, who himself possessed personal combat experience from World War I, firmly believed that aircraft survivability was primarily a function of superior pilot skill and aggressive offensive tactics, rather than relying on structural redundancy. The Luftwaffe had deliberately constructed its fighters to be light and fast, accepting higher loss rates in exchange for perceived performance advantages. When intelligence reports began to consistently note that P-47s were surviving encounters that by all conventional wisdom should have been fatal, the initial response was one of profound skepticism. Pilots, it was suggested, must be overestimating their hits, or perhaps American pilots were simply experiencing an extraordinary run of luck. Major Gerhard Schöpfel, a highly decorated ace commanding the Tvrg. JG-26 filed a detailed report in late May 1943 describing a particularly intense engagement where he estimated he had put no fewer than 40 rounds into a P-47 without observing it crash. His superiors, however, questioned the accuracy of his assessment, suggesting that the intense stress of combat frequently led to an overcounting of hits. Schöpfel adamantly insisted that his observations were entirely accurate. The P-47, he maintained, had visibly sustained multiple cannon strikes, had been trailing smoke, but had nevertheless maintained controlled flight for a sufficient duration to escape across the English Channel. The Luftwaffe's institutional confidence remained remarkably high throughout May 1943, largely because the statistical evidence, at least on the surface, appeared to support their tactical doctrines. They were indeed shooting down P-47s at rates that, while not as overwhelmingly favorable as those achieved against P-40s, still represented acceptable exchange ratios. What they critically failed to recognize was that they were inadvertently witnessing a classic case of selection bias. The P-47s they successfully destroyed were invariably those that sustained catastrophic hits to the pilot or suffered critical single-point failures. The aircraft that survived with extensive damage were simply not being factored into German loss assessments because they were not crashing on the French side of the Channel, thus remaining unseen and uncounted by German intelligence. Johnson, navigating his severely compromised aircraft, finally crossed the French coast at a mere 8,000 feet. The Thunderbolt was steadily losing altitude at an alarming rate of approximately 200 feet per minute, despite his valiant efforts to maintain level flight. The engine, he knew, was operating on borrowed time and suffering from rapidly deteriorating mechanical integrity. The cylinder head temperatures had soared to such dangerous heights that the gauge needles were completely pegged beyond their maximum readings. Every few agonizing seconds, the engine would miss a beat, emit a guttural cough, shudder violently, and then resume its tortured, faltering rotation. Johnson could distinctly feel each misfire transmitted throughout the airframe as a sharp, resonant vibration, and he knew with chilling certainty that he was counting down the precious moments until complete engine failure. The vast expanse of the English Channel stretched out ominously below him, 40 miles of cold, unforgiving gray water that, given his aircraft's perilous condition, might as well have been an entire ocean. Johnson quickly performed the mental arithmetic, and the answer that emerged was deeply unsettling. At a descent rate of 200 feet per minute and a forward speed of 180 hour, he would inevitably impact the frigid water a disheartening 15 miles short of the English coast. Ditching a P-47 in rough seas was, in theory, a survivable maneuver. The aircraft's wide fuselage and the buoyant radial engine afforded it some inherent flotation characteristics, but ultimate survival hinged, critically, on the pilot remaining conscious and uninjured during the violent impact. Johnson had already sustained shrapnel wounds. His depth perception was severely compromised by the extensively cracked canopy, and he had no operational hydraulics for the landing gear, which meant the wheels would remain retracted, ensuring a belly-first impact. He desperately attempted the radio again, fully aware it was dead, yet clinging to a faint, desperate hope that some circuit had miraculously survived. All he received was a desolate symphony of static and silence. There was no way to call for air-sea rescue, no means to alert the RAF stations along the coast that a critically damaged American fighter was inbound and would, in all likelihood, require immediate and urgent assistance. I am from the United States, and I find this video topic absolutely fascinating and incredibly well-researched. The P-47 Thunderbolt's legendary toughness is a story that deserves to be told with such detail, highlighting the often overlooked engineering brilliance and the human element of pilots like Johnson. It really brings to life the stark contrast in design philosophies between the Allied and Axis powers, and how that played out in the brutal realities of air combat. The critically compromised machine would likely need immediate assistance. Alone in his cockpit, Johnson faced a stark dilemma with a dying aircraft, his critical choices determining whether he would rest in an English bed that night or join the roster of the fallen on the missing in action lists. Despite his diligent attempts at management, the engine temperature continued its perilous ascent. Johnson had already reduced power to its absolute minimum cruise setting, leaning the fuel mixture as much as he dared, but the internal damage was simply too extensive. Within that engine, metal was grinding with abrasive friction against metal, bearings were running without lubrication, and pistons were gouging cylinder walls with every relentless stroke. Even through the confines of his oxygen mask, he could now distinctly perceive the unmistakable odor of an engine consuming itself, a noxious blend of hot metal and burning oil, a smell every aviator instantly recognized as the harbinger of catastrophic failure. Just 10 miles from the French coast, the propeller suddenly began an erratic, uncontrolled rotation. Johnson instantly perceived the alarming alteration. Instead of the smooth, rhythmic turning, the prop was now jerking and momentarily seizing, the damaged engine no longer capable of providing steady propulsion. He adjusted the propeller pitch control only to encounter no functionality. The hydraulic system that regulated the blade angle was gone, shot away during that second harrowing pass over France. Consequently, the prop was now fixed at whatever pitch it had settled into. An aerodynamic bite that was far from optimal for the meager power the dying engine could still produce. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be great. The French coast passed beneath the fuselage at 13:47 hours, precisely 32 minutes after the commencement of the engagement. Johnson was at 3,200 feet, still continuing his downward trajectory, the engine now producing perhaps 60% of its designed output, and steadily diminishing. The channel unfurled before him, and for the first time since taking those hits, Johnson permitted a fleeting consideration that he might actually make it. The English coast was discernible as a faint silhouette against the distant sky, perhaps 30 miles away. Based on his current descent rate and speed, the prognosis was tight, yet conceivable. Then, without warning, the engine catastrophically locked. It was not a gradual demise, not a series of warning coughs or sputters, but an instantaneous cessation. One moment it was running rough. The next it was immobilized irrevocably. The propeller became rigidly fixed in place, stopped partway through its arc by internal damage that had finally exceeded even the R-2800's remarkable resilience. The sudden silence that followed was profoundly startling. Johnson had been listening to that agonized power plant for half an hour, its grinding and coughing having become an almost normal auditory backdrop. Now there was nothing but the keen lament of the wind and the groaning protest of the damaged structure. At 2,000 feet altitude, 28 miles from the English coast, sailing inertly in a heavily damaged warplane with no engine, no hydraulics, and severely limited directional command, Johnson mentally computed the aerodynamic efficiency. The P-47 exhibited notoriously poor gliding performance even in the most ideal conditions, typically advancing roughly 8 feet horizontally for every foot of altitude lost, with battle damage and a frozen propeller creating considerable aerodynamic resistance. That ratio might drop to perhaps 6-to-1. To cover 28 miles, he needed 147,840 feet of glide distance. From 2,000 feet, he had, at best, maybe 12,000 feet of glide available. The calculation was insurmountable. He wasn't going to make it. Yet Johnson reached the shores of England at a mere 200 feet. The Thunderbolt's glide extended far beyond conventional aerodynamic expectations, a testament to a combination of sheer will and precise, subtle adjustments that kept the aircraft precariously maintained equilibrium at the threshold of aerodynamic collapse. He had traversed the last 15 miles in a gradient of descent so incredibly flat that it defied established physical principles. But somehow, the P-47's massive wing area and Johnson's profound mastery of kinetic and potential energy conversion had extracted every conceivable measure of distance from the available altitude. He barely surmounted the iconic chalk precipices with a mere 50-foot margin, close enough that he could clearly discern individual seabirds dispersing from the sheer cliff face. The nearest Royal Air Force installation within his grasp was Hawkinge, a modest fighter base near Folkestone that had been at the vanguard during the Battle of Britain 3 years prior. Johnson was devoid of any functional communication system to call ahead, lacking any visual distress indicators to signal an emergency. Nothing but a critically compromised machine descending rapidly toward English farmland at 153. He discerned the landing strip 2 miles ahead, its grass runways laid out in the standard RAF triangle pattern, and resolved upon a direct, unalterable final approach, precluding any chance of a second attempt. The landing gear situation presented a pressing dilemma without a viable remedy. Without hydraulics, the main gear and tail wheel remained retracted and immovably fixed in the up position. While P-47s could execute belly landings, a procedure detailed within the operational manual and practiced by ground crews in training, the manual presupposed a managed descent with functional aerodynamic surfaces and full pitch command. Johnson possessed neither. His flaps were hydraulically operated and consequently inoperative. His elevator cables were partially compromised, affording him perhaps 20% of standard vertical maneuverability. He would be landing at high speed, nose high, and incapable of executing a controlled touchdown. Johnson configured his approach by innate intuition rather than prescribed protocol, adjusting the handful of mechanisms that retained functionality. He couldn't lower the flaps, so his approach speed would be perilously elevated, likely 140 meters over the runway's entry point instead of the normal 90 with flaps extended. He couldn't adjust the propeller, which was still immovably fixed at its point of mechanical failure, creating tremendous aerodynamic resistance. His fuel-air mixture lever was immobilized, the throttle was superfluous without a power source, and the majority of his cockpit gauges lay shattered. He was navigating purely by visual cues and tactile sensation, a method reminiscent of how pilots had landed aircraft in the nascent era of aviation before instrument panels existed. The Hawking duty officer observed the distressed Thunderbolt on final approach and promptly dispatched emergency services. Even from the ground, the aircraft's condition was unmistakable. Gaping perforations in the wings, a segment of the empennage absent, the cockpit enclosure splintered, and grim discolorations along the fuselage that could have been residue of lubricants or scorching. The fact that it was still airborne appeared utterly improbable. The fact that the pilot was attempting a landing rather than bailing out bordered on suicidal. Johnson transgressed the perimeter of the aerodrome at 100 feet, the P-47 descending more precipitously than desired, but manageable only by the most generous interpretation of the word. He gently pulled the control column rearward, attempting to mitigate the downward trajectory, and the aircraft reacted with notable reluctance. The terrain surged upward, grass fields giving way to the mowed runway surface, and Johnson realized with unwavering certainty that he was going to impact with considerable force. He forcibly pulled the control column to its rearward limit, the damaged elevator cables straining to their utmost, and the Thunderbolt's nose came up maybe 5 degrees, just enough to transform the collision geometry from utterly destructive to merely severe. The P-47 made contact with the turf airstrip, fuselage first, at 135 by force. The impact was immediate and ferociously impactful. 7 tons of aircraft underwent rapid deceleration from vehicular velocity to complete immobility in the space of 400 yards. The underside plating ripped into jagged fragments, the harsh abrasion of metal against soil and foliage creating a cacophony akin to a rolling thunderclap, merging with the shriek of a locomotive leaving its tracks. Earth and detritus erupted skyward around the fuselage. The propeller blades buckled rearward as they gouged into the terrain. The right wing arched acutely skyward, the structural beam at last succumbing under impact loads. For a fleeting moment, it appeared the whole wing assembly would detach, but it held. The Thunderbolt furrowed its way across the verdant expanse, discarding components and dissipating kinetic energy simultaneously, leaving a distinctive plume of dirt and aviation fuel. Johnson was violently propelled into his safety restraints, the shoulder straps gouging into skin already marred by contusions and hemorrhage from shrapnel. His head jerked violently forward, striking the aiming mechanism, inflicting a laceration above his right eye that instantly obscured his sight with crimson. The deceleration seemed interminable, as if subjected to an unseen immense compressive force. Every internal viscera pressed tightly against skeletal structures, pulmonary capacity forcibly expelled involuntarily. The aircraft at last came to a halt 380 yards from the initial impact, positioned approximately parallel with the runway, but tilted 15 degrees to starboard where the damaged wing had dug in. A profound quietude enveloped the scene, broken only by the faint metallic crepitation of cooling metal and the distant sound of approaching fire trucks. Johnson sat in the cockpit, momentarily incapable of comprehending that he was on the ground in England, alive. His hands were still clenched immovably on the flight controls. His sinews agonizingly contracted from the vice-like hold he'd maintained for the last 45 minutes. The cockpit enclosure was immovably fastened, its structural integrity compromised by collision stresses. Johnson tried the rapid egress system, but it yielded no response. No hydraulics, no compressed air backup, nothing. He was confined within a mangled machine that faced imminent combustion, combustible liquids saturating superheated components. The acrid stench of fuel and lubricant saturated the superheated metallic airframe. In a remarkably swift response, the emergency crash team converged on the P-47 within a mere minute and a half. Fire personnel, a flurry of activity, clambered across the aircraft's body, wielding axes and crowbars. They meticulously assaulted the canopy's structural framework, with specialized implements specifically engineered to extricate aviators from compromised combat aircraft. Upon successfully forcing the canopy ajar, Johnson practically tumbled from the cockpit, his limbs convulsing from a combination of significant blood loss and the profound physiological impact of shock. A waiting medical officer skillfully intercepted him, gently guiding him to the earth, and immediately commenced a thorough evaluation of his wounds. Throughout this examination, Johnson, in a persistent and almost obsessive manner, reiterated a singular demand: count the perforations. It is imperative to tally the holes. The medical officer, initially surmising Johnson's insistence stemmed from a state of shock-induced delirium, was quickly disabused of this notion when Johnson seized his arm, repeating his instruction with such fervent conviction that the officer conceded, nodding in understanding, and reassuring him that the dedicated ground crew would indeed undertake a comprehensive and meticulous damage assessment. The onerous task of conducting the formal damage assessment fell upon Staff Sergeant Arthur Williams, a highly experienced ground crew chief whose expertise in fighter aircraft maintenance predated the outbreak of hostilities. Throughout his distinguished service, Williams had witnessed numerous combat-scarred aircraft return precariously from engagements over France, their airframes bearing the unmistakable evidence of fierce aerial conflict. He was accustomed to P-47s peppered with shrapnel from anti-aircraft fire, riddled with machine gun impacts, and even exhibiting the more destructive effects of cannon strikes. However, as he commenced his routine perimeter inspection of Johnson's formidable Thunderbolt on the afternoon of May 26th, his detailed examination quickly revealed an unprecedented level of destruction. He ceased his initial tally after surveying just the initial wing panel, the sheer scale of the damage compelling him to immediately seek out his commanding officer for further instruction and to convey the extraordinary nature of his findings. The subsequent morning, May the 27th, saw the formal and meticulously documented assessment commence, complete with extensive photographic records. Staff Sergeant Williams, accompanied by 2 capable assistants, arrived equipped with a clipboard containing specialized grid sheets. These documents were specifically designed for precisely mapping the locations of damage onto standard schematic diagrams of the P-47. Their methodical inspection began at the aircraft's nose and proceeded systematically towards the tail, with each perforation, every rupture, and every site where German projectiles had penetrated the airframe being carefully noted and marked. This exhaustive procedure consumed a full 4 hours. The astonishing final tally registered 203 distinct points of impact, a figure so extraordinary that Williams himself initially found it incredible and felt compelled to verify the count on 2 separate occasions to ensure its absolute accuracy. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The intricate pattern of destruction meticulously narrated the dramatic saga of Johnson's aerial confrontation with forensic precision. The starboard wing alone had sustained a staggering 68 direct impacts, with the vast majority of these concentrated within a concentrated 6-foot segment. Here, a 20 mm cannon shell had catastrophically detonated within the primary structural spar. The resulting blast had utterly obliterated much of the internal framework, leaving the wing's outer skin shredded and dangling in ragged strips. Despite this devastating internal compromise, the forward spar, against all odds, had miraculously retained sufficient structural integrity to prevent the entire wing from shearing off, thereby keeping it tenuously connected to the fuselage. A careful examination revealed 3 distinct penetrations in the aircraft's fuel tanks, each conspicuously encircled by the characteristic swelling of the pioneering self-sealing compound, which had ingeniously sealed the breaches and thus averted any catastrophic fuel leakage. The main body of the fuselage exhibited an astonishing 114 individual impact points, extending from the immediate vicinity of the engine bay all the way to the aircraft's tail assembly. A number of these strikes had completely perforated both sides of the fuselage, the projectiles entering one side and exiting the other, carving a destructive path through the intricate internal structural components. In a truly harrowing detail, a single 20 mm shell had penetrated the airframe a mere 18 inches astern of the cockpit, proceeding on an oblique trajectory forward, before lodging itself unexploded within the delicate radio equipment bay. The specialized ordnance disposal unit that subsequently extracted this projectile unequivocally confirmed it to be a high explosive round that had, by sheer chance, failed to detonate. This astonishing stroke of fortune alone had prevented the warhead from simultaneously annihilating both the cockpit and the pilot. The magnitude of the damage inflicted upon the tail section was so profound that Staff Sergeant Williams, in his initial assessment, categorized the aircraft as irreparably damaged, deeming it beyond any economically viable restoration. The vertical stabilizer, a critical component for directional stability, was riddled with 21 distinct perforations. Among them, 3 significant ruptures that had excised portions of the rudder so substantial that one could literally see through them. Both horizontal stabilizers each displayed 16 impact points, with one elevator rendered almost entirely non-functional. Remarkably, this was the very control surface Johnson had relied upon to maneuver the aircraft during his harrowing landing. The improbable persistence of any degree of control authority was ascribed to the P-47's ingeniously redundant cable routing system, a design feature that allowed for partial operational capability even when primary control cables had been compromised or completely severed. The formidable R-2800 engine presented its own incredible narrative of mechanical defiance in the face of impossible odds. Upon the removal of its protective cowling by Williams and his dedicated team, they uncovered a power plant that appeared as if it had served as an impromptu target for live fire practice. 3 of its cylinders had sustained direct hits. One so extensively compromised that the internal piston was plainly visible through a gaping hole in the cylinder wall itself. The crucial accessory case lay shattered, the vital oil pump utterly destroyed, and the magneto housing bore impact damage that, by all engineering principles, should have instantly extinguished any possibility of ignition. Yet, against all rational expectations, this severely wounded engine had miraculously continued its operation for a full 32 minutes subsequent to the initial enemy assault, generating sufficient thrust to propel Johnson and his crippled aircraft across 50 miles of perilous enemy-held airspace and treacherous open sea. Alexander Kartveli, the distinguished chief engineer at Republic Aviation, received the comprehensive damage assessment report in the early days of June, accompanied by a collection of photographs. His initial reaction was to presume these images depicted a composite of damage sustained by multiple aircraft, so extensive and varied was the destruction. However, when definitive confirmation arrived that all the depicted damage originated from a single P-47, Kartveli promptly submitted a formal request for the aircraft's return. He desired its shipment back to the Republic factory in Farmingdale, New York, for an exhaustive and forensic engineering analysis. This extraordinary request received official sanction, and thus Johnson's P-47, bearing the serial number 428487, undertook its transatlantic voyage, nestled within the cargo hold of a ship, repatriated not as a weapon of war, but as a vital specimen for scientific and engineering study. By mid-June 1943, the 8th Air Force had disseminated the detailed damage assessment report to every P-47 fighter group stationed across England. This crucial document incorporated Staff Sergeant Williams's impactful photographs, alongside a thorough technical analysis authored by Republic's engineering team, which elucidated the remarkable reasons behind the aircraft's survival. Group commanders subsequently integrated this compelling documentation into their pilot briefings, presenting irrefutable, tangible evidence that the P-47 possessed an unparalleled capacity to withstand battle damage that would undoubtedly obliterate any other fighter aircraft operating within the European theater. The resultant psychological ramifications were profound. Aviators who had previously harbored reservations or questions concerning their aircraft's resilience now possessed incontrovertible proof that the Thunderbolt unequivocally lived up to its formidable and growing reputation for durability. Within a mere fortnight, intelligence networks within the Luftwaffe had become fully appraised of Johnson's astonishing survival. German pilots, who had been patrolling the skies above the English Channel, had visually observed the heavily smoking P-47 traverse the coastline, and based on standard combat experience, had unequivocally presumed its imminent crash shortly thereafter, a typical and expected fate for an aircraft sustaining such extensive damage. However, when decoded radio transmissions and subsequent interrogations of captured personnel provided irrefutable confirmation that not only had the pilot miraculously endured, but the aircraft itself had been successfully brought back to base, Luftwaffe tactical analysis officers were compelled to initiate a fundamental reevaluation of their existing engagement doctrines. These critical intelligence reports reached Major Gerhard Schöpfel, a prominent figure at JG-26 in late June. His receipt of this information coincided with a growing influx of similar accounts from other German pilots, all detailing instances of P-47s absorbing what should have been unequivocally fatal damage and, against all expectations, successfully disengaging. Schöpfel promptly revised his tactical briefings to accurately reflect this stark new operational reality. The P-47 was unequivocally not an easily dispatched adversary. Consequently, attacking pilots were instructed to execute more precisely targeted strikes aimed at the Thunderbolt's critical vulnerabilities, and they were explicitly warned against assuming that merely visible damage guaranteed an imminent crash. Furthermore, a significant adjustment was made to the recommended ammunition load-out, shifting from a balanced mix of armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds to a substantially higher proportion of armor-piercing projectiles. These rounds were specifically designed to achieve deep penetration into vital internal systems, rather than merely inflicting spectacular yet ultimately non-fatal superficial damage. By August 1943, the official Luftwaffe doctrine had evolved to explicitly caution against disengaging from attacks on damaged P-47s unless the American fighter was definitively observed to be engulfed in flames or engaged in an uncontrolled spiraling descent. German pilots received stringent instructions to pursue damaged Thunderbolts across the English Channel, fuel permitting, with the express purpose of confirming actual crashes, rather than prematurely claiming probable kills based solely on superficial visual damage. This profound doctrinal shift represented a foundational alteration in German tactical philosophy, a change driven by the overwhelming and accumulated empirical evidence that American engineering had successfully conceived and produced a fighter aircraft that operated under an entirely distinct set of operational rules compared to anything they had previously encountered in combat. Johnson made his remarkable return to active combat operations on June 13, 1943, a mere 18 days subsequent to the mission that, by all rational measures, should have claimed his life. The 56th Fighter Group promptly allocated him a pristine P-47, and he piloted this new machine with an almost palpable sense of self-assurance that was immediately discernible to his fellow aviators. There exists a profound psychological metamorphosis that often occurs within a pilot who endures an experience universally deemed unsurvivable. This crucible either utterly shatters their spirit, rendering them incapable of further combat, or conversely, it forges within them a unique brand of aggressive fearlessness, meticulously constructed upon the concrete foundation of proven invincibility. Johnson unequivocally belonged to the latter category. He had been relentlessly shredded by enemy fire, and yet had not only lived but had successfully returned. The formidable Luftwaffe had unleashed their most destructive capabilities. And still, he had managed to land safely back in England. The very aircraft that many had dismissed as excessively heavy, unduly sluggish, and inherently vulnerable had, against all odds, absorbed an astonishing 203 direct hits and triumphantly delivered him home. This newly acquired resolute confidence permeated throughout the 56th Fighter Group, extending its influence far beyond its immediate ranks. Aviators who had previously approached the P-47's operational limits with a degree of tentative caution now exhibited a heightened willingness to push their aircraft more aggressively, to prolong their engagement in dogfights, and to embrace tactical risks they had previously shied away from. The profound realization that their aircraft possessed the extraordinary capacity to absorb immense battle damage and yet continue its flight fundamentally altered their tactical calculations. Whereas a P-47 pilot might once have disengaged after sustaining a few hits, they now meticulously assessed the extent of the damage and frequently chose to remain actively engaged in combat, provided their critical systems continued to function. The Thunderbolt, therefore, transcended its mere identity as a combat aircraft. It evolved into a potent psychological weapon, imbuing American pilots with a formidable courage that the Luftwaffe, with all its analytical prowess, simply could not quantify or counteract. Johnson himself emerged as the quintessential embodiment of this engineering marvel, a veritable living testament and a walking advertisement for the exceptional ingenuity of Republic aviation. By the cessation of hostilities, he had amassed an impressive tally of 27 confirmed aerial victories, thereby solidifying his status as one of the preeminent American aces operating within the European theater. He undertook a remarkable 91 combat missions and astonishingly survived being shot down on one further occasion, once again while piloting a P-47 and once again returning safely to base. Other pilots, recognizing his unparalleled experience, frequently sought his counsel, inquiring about his specialized techniques and earnestly endeavoring to comprehend how he had managed to keep that severely damaged Thunderbolt aloft and flying across the treacherous English Channel. His consistent and unwavering response to their queries was always the same. Place your trust implicitly in the aircraft, possess an intimate understanding of your systems, and never, under any circumstances, abandon a P-47 until it is physically incapable of sustained flight. It physically can't fly anymore, a sentiment that might have been uttered about many aircraft in the brutal skies of World War II. Yet the P-47 Thunderbolt frequently defied such pronouncements. By the close of 1943, the profound consequences of this exceptional resilience on American fighter operations became strikingly evident and thoroughly measurable. The rate of P-47 losses per individual sortie experienced a dramatic decline, plummeting from the alarming figures observed between April and May to approximately 1.2% by September. This significant improvement occurred even as the intensity and frequency of aerial engagements escalated. While a portion of this enhanced survivability was undoubtedly attributable to the growing experience of the pilots and the refinement of their tactical approaches, a substantial contribution stemmed from aviators choosing to remain with their severely damaged aircraft, electing to attempt a return to base rather than prematurely abandoning their machines. Aircraft that, under previous operational doctrines, would have been unequivocally declared lost, were instead successfully brought back to England, subjected to comprehensive repairs, and subsequently reinstated into active combat duty. This meant that the effective operational strength of the 8th Air Force's fighter arm expanded considerably. Without the introduction of a single new aircraft, the command was simply able to keep a greater number of battle-scarred Thunderbolts in the fight. Republic Aviation, the manufacturer of the formidable P-47, capitalized extensively on Johnson's remarkable survival story in its educational materials and technical documentation. The company meticulously compiled a detailed case study surrounding the extraordinary incident involving 203 hits, subsequently disseminating this comprehensive report to various military procurement offices and allied air forces. This vital documentation served a dual strategic purpose. It unequivocally validated Republic's fundamental design philosophies and provided incontrovertible, tangible proof of the intrinsic value of robust aircraft construction, even when such resilience came at the inevitable cost of increased weight and greater manufacturing expense. When detractors and skeptics questioned the rationale behind the P-47's considerably higher production cost compared to other contemporary fighter aircraft, Republic could powerfully counter their arguments by presenting photographs of Johnson's astonishingly damaged aircraft, compellingly asking what monetary value could truly be placed upon the preservation of a pilot's life. We invite you to stay with us and watch the end of the video to uncover the full story. We would be immensely grateful for your like and subscription. Please also consider sharing where you are from and your thoughts on the video's compelling topic in the comments section below. The Luftwaffe's necessary recalibration of its combat strategies, driven by the P-47's demonstrated durability, initiated a pervasive cascading effect throughout German fighter operations during the latter half of 1943. Pilots who had previously engaged Thunderbolts with a degree of assured confidence now approached these American fighters with an altogether new and pronounced caution, having learned through bitter experience that riddling a P-47 with gunfire did not, by any means, guarantee a definitive kill. This newfound circumspection on the part of German aviators invariably led to protracted engagement durations, which in turn translated into less available time for them to attack the vulnerable bomber formations. The direct consequence of this shift was a discernible improvement in the survival rates of Allied bombers. The P-47's burgeoning reputation as an almost indestructible damage sponge began to exert its psychological influence even before the first shots were exchanged. German pilots were compelled to commit greater resources, more aircraft, more ammunition, and to undertake substantially increased risks to achieve kills that they had, in earlier encounters, secured with relative ease. Quantitative evidence illustrating this impact is clearly discernible in the German ammunition expenditure statistics derived from Luftwaffe quartermaster reports. In April 1943, the average number of rounds expended per confirmed P-47 kill stood at approximately 220 for 20mm cannon and 850 for machine guns. By October of the same year, these figures had dramatically escalated, climbing to 380 cannon rounds and 1,400 machine gun rounds for each verified P-47 destruction. This stark increase indicated that German pilots were firing more frequently and achieving a higher number of hits. yet they required a significantly greater volume of impacts to achieve the identical outcome. This pervasive inefficiency rippled through the entire Luftwaffe supply chain, imposing immense strain on both ammunition production and logistical networks at the precise moment when the Allied strategic bombing campaign was specifically targeting those very same critical industrial systems. Beyond the operational and logistical ramifications, a significant psychological dimension also extended to the American bomber crews themselves. Gunners aboard B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators frequently witnessed their P-47 escorts absorbing substantial visible battle damage and yet continuing to fiercely engage the enemy. This sight served as a powerful morale booster during the terrifying and arduous bomber runs deep into German territory. Prior to mid-1943, fighter escorts that sustained hits typically disengaged from combat and headed back to base, leaving the vulnerable bomber formations exposed to further enemy attacks. The inspiring spectacle of heavily damaged Thunderbolts resolutely remaining in the fray, persistently confronting German fighters even while trailing telltale smoke, instilled a profound sense of confidence in the bomber crews. They gained the crucial assurance that their escorts would not abandon them at the initial indication of grave danger. Johnson's extraordinary narrative swiftly became an integral part of 8th Air Force legend, a tale recounted and re-narrated in ready rooms and briefing halls across England. Newly arrived replacement pilots, fresh from the United States, would hear the astonishing story of the 203-hit Thunderbolt even before embarking on their inaugural combat mission. This powerful anecdote served a dual purpose. It functioned as both an inspiration and an invaluable instruction. It offered inspiration that survival was indeed possible, even amidst the most dire and seemingly insurmountable circumstances, and it provided concrete instruction that the P-47 was inherently tougher than its imposing appearance suggested, unequivocally deserving of its pilot's unwavering trust. Robert Johnson had, through his harrowing experience, definitively proven that Alexander Kartvel's seemingly obsessive approach to over-engineering was not a wasteful endeavor, but rather an act of profound wisdom. Every additional pound of structural reinforcement and every redundant system incorporated into the aircraft's design had a critical purpose, a value measured in the preservation of human lives and the successful completion of vital missions. Ultimately, the P-47 Thunderbolt proceeded to execute more missions than any other American fighter aircraft in the European theater of operations, meticulously accumulating a combat record that emphatically validated every previously controversial design decision made by Republic Aviation. It destroyed a greater number of ground targets, flew more escort missions, and brought more pilots safely home than many lighter, more aesthetically elegant fighters that, on paper, appeared to possess superior performance characteristics. Johnson's miraculous survival on May 26, 1943, stood as the ultimate proof of concept, a pivotal event that fundamentally altered the understanding of what an aircraft could truly endure for everyone involved: Americans, British, and Germans alike. The Luftwaffe, in the aftermath, never again referred to Thunderbolts as easy kills, because Johnson had demonstrated, in the most definitive and undeniable way possible, that destroying a P-47 demanded far more than merely hitting it. It necessitated the complete obliteration of something that steadfastly refused to be destroyed.